You said one word. Maybe it was walk. Maybe it was their name, or a sound you make before something good happens. And before you finished the syllable, their head moved. A slow, deliberate tilt, one ear dropping, the other lifting, eyes locked onto your face with an intensity. That feels almost uncomfortably focused. You laughed. Because it's impossible not to. But then the moment passed, and you went back to whatever you were doing. And nobody asked the question that's actually worth asking. What just happened in that brain? Not why it's cute, not why it evolved, but what is literally occurring neurologically in the 3 seconds between the sound reaching your dog's ears and that head rotating on its axis like something inside just shifted into a different gear. Because researchers have been asking exactly that question, and the answer they've built slowly across studies in animal cognition, auditory neuroscience, and social perception is nothing like the explanation most people assume. It's stranger, it's more specific, and it reveals something about how your dog processes you that changes the way the whole behavior looks. The most common explanation is the simplest one. Dogs tilt their heads to hear better. The ear repositions, the angle changes, the sound localizes more accurately. It's a reasonable guess, and it contains just enough truth to be misleading. Dogs do use head position to refine auditory localization. Research on canine hearing confirms that the external ear, the pinna, functions partly as a directional filter, and that head movement can help disambiguate where a sound is coming from. A 2018 review of canine auditory anatomy published in the Journal of Veterinary Behavior noted that head tilting correlates with sounds that fall within a specific frequency range, roughly the range of human speech. So the ears are involved. But here's the problem with stopping there. If the head tilt were purely about sound localization, it would happen most reliably to any unfamiliar sound in that frequency range. A door hinge, a particular note on a piano, a stranger's voice at a distance. It doesn't. The behavior is dramatically more frequent and dramatically more pronounced in response to specific people, specific words, and specific tones. Not just speech in general. Meaningful speech, speech that the dog has learned to associate with something, which means the ears are the entry point. But the brain is doing something much more interesting with what comes through them. In 2021, a research team led by András Martin at Eötvös Loránd University, the Budapest Group, whose work on dog cognition has produced some of the most significant findings of the last decade, published a study in animal cognition that was specifically designed to understand the head tilt. They worked with 40 dog owner pairs and trained the dogs to retrieve specific named objects, toys with distinct labels that the dogs had learned to identify reliably. Gifted dogs. Dogs who had demonstrated genuine vocabulary recognition in previous testing. Then they gave the dogs a task. They were told the name of a toy and asked to go find it. And the researchers filmed what the dogs did in the moments immediately after hearing the instruction and immediately before beginning the search. The finding was this. Dogs who tilted their head during the instruction period retrieved the correct object significantly more often than dogs who didn't tilt. Not slightly more often. Significantly. The head tilt wasn't just a reaction. It was predicting successful word retrieval, which means it was marking a moment of active cognitive engagement, the dog's brain shifting into a processing mode that was distinct from passive listening. The researchers were careful about causation. They weren't claiming the tilt caused better retrieval, but the correlation was strong enough to suggest that both things, the tilt and the successful processing, were outputs of the same underlying event, a moment of focused, effortful cognitive work. Your dog's head tilt isn't decoration. It is, at minimum, a visible marker of something happening in the brain that looks a lot like trying to understand. Now, here's where the neuroscience gets specific, in a way that most coverage of this behavior completely misses. The auditory cortex in dogs, like the auditory cortex in humans, doesn't just receive sound. It processes it in layers. The first layer extracts basic acoustic features: pitch, volume, duration. The second layer begins assigning categorical meaning. Is this a known word? A known voice? A known emotional tone? A 2016 fMRI study at Eötvös Loránd, the same institution, trained 13 dogs to lie still inside a scanner while listening to recordings of human speech. What they found was that dogs process voice, words, and emotional tone in separate but interacting neural systems. The left hemisphere showed a bias toward word processing, the same lateralization humans use for language. The right hemisphere responded more strongly to emotional tone. And the reward regions of the brain, the caudate nucleus specifically, activated only when both the word and the tone carried positive meaning simultaneously. The combination mattered, not just the warm voice, not just the familiar word, both together, at the same time, in the same moment. Now, think about what the head tilt is physically doing in the context of that finding. When a dog hears a human speak, they are running two parallel processing tasks simultaneously, extracting verbal content with one hemisphere, reading emotional tone with the other, and attempting to integrate them into a coherent signal. That integration is cognitively demanding. It requires focus. It requires the kind of attentional narrowing that, in humans, we recognize by the way someone leans forward when they're concentrating. The head tilt may be the dog equivalent of leaning forward, a physical manifestation of the brain increasing its processing effort, adjusting the input to give both systems the clearest possible signal to work with. You're not watching your dog be cute, you're watching them concentrate. There's a secondary mechanism here that adds a visual dimension to the behavior, and it's one that the 2021 Budapest study specifically flagged as underexplored. Dogs read human faces extensively, preferentially. Research from multiple institutions has confirmed that dogs show a left gaze bias when looking at human faces, meaning they orient their eyes toward the right side of a human face, which, in neurological terms, is the side most expressive of emotion. Dogs don't show this bias for objects or for other animals, only for human faces. This matters for the head tilt because of a specific anatomical constraint. Many dogs, particularly those with longer muzzles, have their visual field partially obstructed when they look straight ahead at a human face. The muzzle itself blocks a portion of the lower visual field, which is precisely where the human mouth is. And the human mouth is one of the primary sources of emotional and communicative information that dogs have learned to read. A 2013 study at the University of Portsmouth confirmed that dogs attend to the human mouth significantly more than any other facial feature when processing emotional expressions. Not the eyes, the mouth. If the muzzle is blocking it, the information is degraded. The tilt clears the obstruction. It repositions the visual field so that the full face, including the mouth, becomes visible. Dogs with flatter faces tilt their heads less frequently. This was confirmed in a survey of over 500 dog owners by the Budapest team. The correlation between muzzle length and head tilt frequency was statistically significant. Longer muzzle, more tilting. So the head tilt is doing two things at once, optimizing auditory input for the brain's language and tone processing systems, and simultaneously clearing a visual obstruction to give the facial emotion reading system a cleaner feed. It is, in the most literal sense, your dog trying to perceive you more completely. Adjusting their entire sensory apparatus, ears, eyes, brain, to take in more of you at once. Here is the finding that tends to land differently once you understand everything above it. Not all dogs tilt equally, and the variation isn't random. The Budapest team's 2021 data showed a clear pattern. Dogs who tilted their heads more frequently during word instruction were the same dogs who showed higher performance on object label recognition tasks overall. Higher vocabulary, stronger word meaning associations, more reliable retrieval of named objects across multiple sessions. The head tilt frequency wasn't just correlated with a single successful moment. It was correlated with a dog's general capacity for, and investment in, understanding human language. The dogs who tilted more were the dogs who were working harder, across the board, to understand what humans were saying to them. And here's the layer underneath that finding that the researchers noted carefully. Those dogs weren't necessarily smarter in a general sense. They weren't faster learners across all tasks. The effect was specific to human-directed communication, to the domain of attending to people and trying to extract meaning from what people say, which brings us back to the genetics briefly. The structural variants in GTF2I and GTF2IRD1, the genes associated with extreme human-directed sociability in dogs, don't just predispose dogs to seek human proximity, they predispose them to orient toward humans as sources of meaningful information, to treat human communication as something worth working to understand. The dogs who tilt their heads most are, in a measurable sense, the dogs most deeply engaged in the project of understanding you. Not just hearing you, not just reacting to your tone, actively trying to parse what you mean. There is one more dimension to this that almost never gets mentioned. The head tilt is not a fixed response. It is a learned one. Research on operant conditioning in dogs has consistently shown that behaviors which produce rewarding social responses from humans, attention, laughter, warmth, prolonged eye contact, are reinforced and strengthened over time. The dog's brain registers the response, files it, increases the probability of the behavior recurring. Every time you smiled at the head tilt, you made it slightly more likely to happen again. This doesn't make it cynical or calculated. Dogs don't strategize. But it does mean that the frequency of head tilting in your specific dog is in part a record of how you have responded to it across your entire relationship. The behavior has been shaped by the feedback loop between you. Your dog tilts their head partly because their brain is working to understand you, and partly because, somewhere in the history of your time together, you made it clear, with a smile, with the warmth in your face, that this particular thing they did made you respond to them. The tilt is cognitive effort, and it is also, quietly, a bid for connection. Both things are true at the same time. And knowing that what looks like a simple, automatic, adorable reflex is actually the intersection of auditory neuroscience, visual processing, vocabulary cognition, and the accumulated history of your specific relationship, changes how it looks when it happens again. So the next time you say a word, their name, or walk, or something that means something to them, and that head moves, slow and deliberate, one ear dropping, eyes locking onto your face, here's what's actually happening. Two hemispheres of a brain are simultaneously extracting verbal content and reading emotional tone, trying to integrate them into a signal that means a visual system is clearing its field of view to read your face more completely. A cognitive processing system is shifting into a higher gear, and somewhere underneath all of it, a reinforcement history built across thousands of small moments. Between the two of you is increasing the probability that this particular bid for understanding, this particular reaching toward you, is exactly what comes next. Your dog isn't tilting their head because they're confused. They're tilting their head because you said something, and they are trying with everything their brain has available to understand what you meant. That's not a reflex. That's attention. That's effort. That's a nervous system that has decided your words are worth working to understand. And honestly, given everything the science says about what you are to that brain, it would be stranger if they didn't. If this changed how you'll see that moment the next time it happens, subscribe and leave a comment below. Does your dog tilt more for certain words? Certain people? Tell me what you've noticed. And if you want to understand why your dog chose you as the person worth paying that much attention to, that video is already there.